The Galactic Naval Academy's main hall buzzed with excited chatter as hundreds of alien cadets gathered for their weekly briefing. Representatives from 47 different species filled the massive amphitheater, their varied forms creating a rainbow of colors, textures, and sizes. The crystalline Zilithians sparkled under the artificial lighting, while the massive Corvan delegates cast long shadows across the rows of seats. Commander Vextai, a tall Altarian with 4 arms and silver-scaled skin, stood at the podium reviewing his notes. As the Academy's chief of student affairs, he had delivered thousands of these briefings over his career, but today's topic would be different. Today, they would discuss the most controversial decision in the Academy's 300-year history. Attention, cadets! Commander Vextai's voice echoed through the hall's advanced acoustics system, automatically translating into each species' native language. The chatter died down as hundreds of eyes, optical sensors, and various other sensory organs focused on him. Zephyr, a young Corvan with thick gray hide and tusks that gleamed like polished ivory, nudged his study partner. "Wonder what boring regulation they're updating this time," he whispered to his friend, a serpentine Nixari named Sliss. Sliss's forked tongue flickered with amusement. "Probably something about proper dormitory hygiene protocols again." Commander Vextai cleared his throat, a sound that came out as a harmonious chime due to his species' unique vocal structure. Today's briefing concerns a significant policy change that will affect Academy admissions for the foreseeable future. After extensive deliberation by the Galactic Council's Defense Committee, effective immediately, humans from the planet Earth will no longer be permitted to enroll in any Galactic Naval Academy program. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some cadets exchanged curious glances, while others seemed confused. The human species was relatively new to galactic civilization, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Most cadets had heard of them, but had little direct contact. Furthermore, the commander continued, any humans currently enrolled will be immediately transferred to civilian educational institutions. This decision comes after careful analysis of human psychological profiles and combat assessments conducted by the Council's Xenopsychology Department. Crix, an insectoid thrykin with compound eyes and chitinous armor, raised one of her 4 arms. "Commander, what specific concerns led to this ban? The humans have only been part of galactic society for 5 decades. Commander Vextai consulted his datapad. According to the official report, humans demonstrate concerning aggressive tendencies and unpredictable behavior patterns that make them unsuitable for military service. Their psychological makeup shows dangerous levels of what their own species terms stubbornness and recklessness. The Council fears these traits could compromise mission integrity and endanger Allied forces." Laughter began to spread through the amphitheater. It started with a few chuckles from the Zilithians, whose crystal formations chimed melodically when amused. The sound was infectious, and soon other species joined in. The Corvan cadets' deep, rumbling laughs mixed with the high-pitched giggles of the diminutive Piscian students. "Humans? Too aggressive." Zephyr's tusks gleamed as he grinned. "Have they seen a Corvan's battle charge? We can demolish a reinforced bunker with our bare hands. Or a Thrykin warrior swarm," added Crix, her mandibles clicking with amusement. "My people conquered 12 star systems using nothing but coordinated hive tactics and acid spit." Sliss coiled and uncoiled with mirth. "The Nixari have been known to wage psychological warfare that breaks enemy minds before the first shot is fired. And they're worried about humans being too intense." The laughter grew louder. Even some of the more reserved species, like the telepathic Mindari, seemed to find humor in the situation. Their thoughts projected gentle amusement that other psychically sensitive species picked up on, amplifying the general sense that the human ban was absurd. "Humans are barely 5 feet tall on average," called out a Zilithian cadet, her crystal form refracting light as she spoke. "My species mines asteroids barehanded. How dangerous could these tiny mammals possibly be?" Commander Vextai raised all 4 hands for silence. "Cadets, please. I understand this may seem excessive to some of you. However, the Council's decision is based on extensive research and multiple incident reports." "Incident reports?" Zephyr stood up, his massive frame towering over the surrounding seats. "Commander, What kind of incidents could a species that just learned to leave their home planet possibly cause? The commander hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The details are classified, but I can tell you that several diplomatic missions involving human personnel resulted in unexpected outcomes. The Council believes their inclusion in military operations poses unacceptable risks to galactic security. This triggered another wave of laughter. The idea that a young species, barely beyond their own solar system, could pose a threat to a civilization spanning thousands of worlds struck most cadets as preposterous. Vrick, a gaseous being from the Nebular Collective, spoke through his translation device. Commander, with respect, humans haven't even developed shield technology yet. They still use kinetic weapons and chemical propulsion. What possible threat could they represent to our advanced fleets? Their largest warships are smaller than our training vessels, added a hexapod cadet, her 6 legs clicking against the floor. My grandmother's civilian transport has more firepower than their entire space force. The mockery continued for several minutes. Cadets shared stories they'd heard about human achievements, their primitive computers, their reliance on liquid water, their brief lifespans of less than a century, to beings who lived for millennia and possessed technology that could reshape matter at the molecular level. Humans seemed like children playing with toy weapons. Commander Vextai watched the display with growing discomfort. He had read the classified files, seen the reports that led to this decision. Unlike these cadets, he knew there was more to the story than anyone was being told. But his orders were clear: maintain the official line and avoid discussing specific incidents. The decision has been made, he said firmly, though his voice lacked its earlier authority. Effective immediately, no humans will be admitted to any academy program. Current human students will be relocated to appropriate civilian institutions. This policy will remain in effect until the Council determines that the human species has developed sufficient cultural and psychological maturity for military service. How long could that possibly take? Sliss asked, still chuckling. A few centuries? Maybe a millennium? By then, we'll probably have to remind them which end of a plasma rifle to hold. The laughter reached a crescendo. Even some of the instructors present seemed to be struggling to maintain their composure. The entire assembly appeared to view the human ban as an overreaction to what could only be minor cultural misunderstandings. As the briefing concluded and cadets began filing out of the amphitheater, the conversations continued. Groups clustered together, sharing jokes about human aggression and speculation about what trivial incidents had spooked the Council so badly. Zephyr, Sliss, and Crix walked together toward the Academy's central plaza, still discussing the announcement. The plaza was a marvel of engineering, with artificial gravity allowing beings from different worlds to move comfortably in the same space. Floating gardens from a dozen different biomes created a peaceful environment where cadets could study and socialize. I feel sorry for them, honestly, Crix said, her compound eyes reflecting the light from the plaza's artificial star. Imagine being banned from something before you even had a real chance to prove yourself. Maybe it's for their own good, Zephyr suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't really believe it. Space combat requires precision, discipline, and the ability to follow complex tactical plans. From what I've heard, humans have trouble with authority and tend to act on emotion rather than logic. Sliss nodded, her serpentine head swaying as they walked. I read a report about their global conflicts. They fight each other over resources, territory, even abstract concepts like religion and ideology. How could beings that can't maintain peace on their own world handle the complexities of interstellar warfare? Other groups were having similar conversations throughout the plaza. The consensus was universal. While the ban might seem harsh, it was probably necessary. Humans simply weren't ready for the responsibilities that came with galactic military service. Near the Academy's memorial wall, where the names of fallen graduates were etched in imperishable crystal, a small group of senior cadets gathered around Instructor Mordain, an elderly Altarian who had served in the Galactic Navy for over 2 centuries. Instructor, one of the cadets asked, you've been here longer than anyone. Have you ever encountered humans in a military context? Mordain was quiet for a long moment, his 4 hands clasped behind his back as he studied the memorial wall. His silver scales had darkened with age, and His movements carried the careful precision of someone who had seen too much combat. "I have," he said finally, his voice so quiet the cadets had to lean in to hear him. "Once, during the Frontier incident 15 years ago." The cadets exchanged glances. The Frontier incident was rarely discussed, classified at the highest levels. Most of them only knew it had involved a diplomatic mission gone wrong in the outer territories. "What were they like?" asked a young Mindari cadet, her large cranium pulsing with curious thought patterns. Mordain turned away from the memorial, his eyes distant. "Different than you might expect." The human liaison was a female named Sarah Chun. Small, even by human standards. Quiet, thoughtful, always asking questions about our procedures and protocols. "Sounds harmless enough," one cadet commented. "That's what we all thought," Mordain replied. "Right up until everything went to hell." The instructor fell silent, clearly lost in old memories. After a moment, he shook his head and focused on the cadets again. "The point is, young ones, that appearances can be deceiving. The council's decision may seem extreme, but they have access to information you don't. Trust in their wisdom." As the afternoon progressed, and cadets attended their regular classes, the topic of the human band continued to dominate conversations. In tactical analysis courses, students joked about how human unpredictability might actually be a weakness rather than a strength. In xenobiology classes, they discussed human physiology and how their primitive evolutionary background made them unsuitable for modern warfare. The general mood remained one of amused dismissal mixed with mild pity. These young cadets, representing the best and brightest of dozens of advanced civilizations, simply couldn't conceive of a scenario where primitive humans could pose any kind of serious threat. But in the Academy's deepest archives, locked behind multiple layers of security and accessible only to the highest-ranking officials, sat a collection of files that told a very different story. Files that contained incident reports, battle recordings, and psychological evaluations that painted a picture of humanity that would have shocked every cadet in that amphitheater. Files that contained the real reason humans had been banned from the Galactic Naval Academy. And somewhere in the Academy's communication center, a message was being prepared. A message that would soon reach Earth, informing the human government of the Council's decision. The message was routine, professional, and gave no hint of the classified information that had prompted it. What the Academy officials didn't know was that this message would eventually find its way to former Lieutenant Sarah Chun, now retired and working as a civilian contractor on Earth's orbital defense platforms. And Sarah Chun, unlike the alien cadets who had laughed at the ban, would understand exactly why the Galactic Council had made their decision. She would remember the Frontier incident very differently than Instructor Mordain had described it. She would remember what really happened when diplomacy failed and humanity showed the galaxy something it wasn't prepared to see. But, for now, the cadets laughed, the instructors maintained their silence, and the truth remained locked away in classified files, waiting for the day when it would finally come to light. 3 weeks after the announcement, the human band had become a running joke throughout the Academy. Cadets would reference it during training exercises, making comments about human-level tactics when someone made a particularly reckless or emotional decision. The phrase had become synonymous with primitive, ineffective military thinking. Zephyr was in the middle of such a joke during combat simulation training when Instructor Calvin called for attention. The training bay was massive, designed to accommodate the various environmental needs of different species. Atmospheric processors maintained separate zones for methane breathers, high-gravity beings, and others with specialized requirements. Today's exercise will focus on tactical decision-making under extreme pressure, Calvin announced. The instructor was a Vorthan, a species known for their analytical minds and strategic brilliance. His tall, ethereal form seemed to flow rather than walk as he moved between the training pods. You will be presented with historical scenarios and asked to devise solutions using available resources. Sliss coiled nervously around her control station. Historical scenarios are always the hardest. You know the outcome happened, but you have to figure out how. Crix's mandibles clicked with anticipation. I love these challenges. The key is to think like the original commanders, but with our superior modern perspective. The first scenario loaded into their shared simulation space. The tactical display showed a star system under siege, with civilian evacuation ships trapped by enemy forces. The cadets quickly began formulating plans, drawing on their extensive training in fleet tactics and strategic thinking. Standard relief formation, Zephyr suggested, his thick fingers manipulating the holographic interface. Heavy cruisers engage the enemy line while fast frigates escort the evacuees to safety. Agreed, Sliss added. But we should use the asteroid field for cover. Navigate the evacuation ships through the debris to mask their signatures. The other cadets in their training group nodded approvingly. It was a solid plan that minimized casualties while achieving the objective. They submitted their solution and waited for the simulation to run. The result was a disaster. Their carefully planned formation was shredded by enemy fire, the evacuation ships were destroyed, and civilian casualties numbered in the millions. The holographic display showed debris fields where their ships had been, a stark reminder of tactical failure. What happened? Crix demanded, reviewing the battle data. Our formation should have worked. The enemy positions were clearly marked. Instructor Calvin's form shimmered with what might have been amusement. The enemy commanders were not following standard tactical doctrine. They employed what your species would consider irrational strategies. Kamikaze attacks, sacrificial gambits, and emotional decision-making that defied logical prediction. Zephyr snorted. Sounds like human-level thinking to me. Emotional, reckless, and ultimately self-destructive. Indeed, Calvin replied quietly. This was the Battle of Kepler Station, 15 years ago. The enemy forces were pirates who had taken civilians hostage. The rescue operation was led by a joint galactic Navy task force. Sliss's tongue flickered with interest. A historical battle? Who commanded the successful rescue? The instructor paused, his luminous eyes seeming to study each cadet carefully. The operation was ultimately successful, with minimal civilian casualties and complete neutralization of the pirate threat. The commanding officer's tactical innovations have since been classified and removed from standard military doctrine. Classified? Crix's compound eyes reflected confusion. Why would successful tactics be classified? Because, came a new voice from the training bay's entrance. Those tactics were developed by a human. The cadets turned to see Instructor Mordain entering the chamber, his silver scales darker than usual. Behind him walked a figure that immediately commanded attention. Admiral Thexani, the Academy's director and one of the most decorated officers in Galactic Navy history. The Admiral was a Nexian, a species known for their longevity and wisdom. Her crystalline exoskeleton pulsed with internal light, and her multiple sensory appendages moved with precise, measured gestures. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded fleets across 100 star systems. Cadets, she said, her words automatically translating but carrying emotional undertones that transcended language. Your instructor thought it might be educational to provide some context for recent policy decisions. Zephyr straightened to attention, his massive frame dwarfing even the Admiral. Ma'am, we've been wondering about the details behind the human ban. If their tactics were successful, why were they classified? Admiral Thexani gestured toward the simulation display, which still showed the aftermath of their failed rescue attempt. Reload the scenario. This time, I want you to observe the actual historical outcome. The display reset, showing the same star system, the same enemy positions, the same trapped civilian ships. But now the cadet observers were watching from outside the simulation, able to see the entire battle as it had actually unfolded. The human task force appeared at the edge of the system. 3 ships, smaller than anything the cadets had used in their attempt. The lead vessel was barely the size of a modern frigate, with primitive-looking weapons and basic shielding. Only 3 ships. Sliss asked incredulously. We used 12 and still failed. Watch, Mordain said grimly. What followed defied everything the cadets had learned about proper military tactics. The human commander, a Captain Chun according to the data readout, began by broadcasting surrender terms to the pirates. When these were rejected, she did something unprecedented. She rammed her ship directly into the largest enemy vessel. The cadets watched in shock as the human ship's crude nuclear reactor was deliberately overloaded at the moment of impact. The explosion vaporized both vessels instantly, creating a massive electromagnetic pulse that disabled half the pirate fleet. That's... Crick struggled to find words. That's suicide. How does that help the civilians? Keep watching, Admiral Thexani instructed. The remaining 2 human ships moved through the chaos with impossible precision. Instead of following standard engagement protocols, they used the debris field from the explosion as cover, launching what appeared to be cargo pods toward the civilian ships. But these weren't cargo pods. They were human boarding teams in primitive spacesuits, propelling themselves through vacuum with nothing but small chemical rockets. The cadets watched in stunned silence as these tiny figures somehow made it across the battle zone and began cutting their way into the civilian vessels. They're going to get themselves killed, Zephyr muttered. Space combat isn't supposed to work like this. The boarding teams worked with terrifying efficiency. Within minutes, they had secured the civilian ships and were piloting them away from the battle. Meanwhile, the 2 remaining human vessels continued their assault on the pirates, using tactics that made no logical sense. One ship pretended to suffer engine failure, drifting helplessly until pirate vessels moved in for the kill. Then, it suddenly accelerated, using its own hull as a battering ram to destroy 2 enemy ships while somehow surviving the impact itself. The other human ship broadcast false surrender signals while simultaneously launching boarding parties at every enemy vessel within range. The pirates, confused by these contradictory signals, hesitated just long enough for the human boarders to reach their ships. What happened next would haunt the cadets for years to come. The human boarding parties didn't follow standard capture protocols. They moved through enemy ships like a force of nature, using primitive kinetic weapons and what appeared to be improvised explosives. Ship after ship fell silent as the humans carved their way to critical systems. They're not taking prisoners, Sliss observed, her voice barely a whisper. The pirates had already executed 17 civilian hostages, Admiral Thexani explained. Captain Chun decided that surrender was no longer an option. The battle ended in 43 minutes. Every pirate vessel was either destroyed or captured. All remaining civilian ships were rescued. The human casualties were severe. Captain Chin's sacrifice had been just the beginning. Of the 300 humans who participated in the operation, only 87 survived. But they had succeeded where a larger, better-equipped force would have failed. The simulation chamber fell silent except for the hum of machinery. The cadets stared at the tactical display, trying to process what they had witnessed. Everything they had been taught about proper military conduct, about minimizing casualties, and following established protocols, had been thrown aside in favor of something far more primitive and far more effective. I don't understand, Zephyr said finally. Their tactics were successful, but they were also... He struggled to find the right word. Terrifying, Crix finished. They fought like berserkers, not like trained military personnel. Exactly, Admiral Thexani replied. And that's why humans have been banned from military service. Not because they're incompetent, but because they're too effective in ways that violate our understanding of civilized warfare. Sliss uncoiled and recoiled nervously. But surely this was an isolated incident. One desperate battle doesn't define an entire species. Instructor Mordain activated another display. This was the first time we encountered human military thinking, but it wasn't the last. Over the past 15 years, there have been 47 documented incidents where human personnel were involved in military or security operations. New data flooded the display, battle reports, casualty figures, and tactical analyses from dozens of engagements. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. When humans were involved, casualty rates dropped dramatically for Allied forces, objectives were achieved ahead of schedule, and enemy forces often suffered complete annihilation. But the methods used were consistently outside the bounds of acceptable military conduct. Suicide attacks, psychological warfare, and tactics that prioritized mission success over personal survival were common themes in every report. The Centauri Rebellion. Mordain continued, highlighting one particular incident. Rebel forces had taken control of 3-star systems and were threatening to expand further. A human advisor suggested infiltrating their command structure by allowing themselves to be captured. The cadets watched as the plan unfolded. Human intelligence operatives had deliberately walked into enemy hands, enduring torture and imprisonment while gathering critical information. When the rescue operation finally came, it wasn't to save the human agents. It was to exploit the weaknesses they had discovered. They let themselves be captured? Zephyr couldn't hide his disbelief. That's not intelligence work. That's martyrdom. The rebellion ended in 4 months instead of the projected 3 years, Admiral Thexani noted. Galactic Navy casualties were reduced by an estimated 90%. The human advisors survived, though they required extensive psychological rehabilitation afterward. Another incident appeared on the display, the frontier mining dispute. What should have been a simple negotiation between rival companies had escalated into armed conflict when pirates began raiding both sides. The human mediator's solution had been elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its execution. She had convinced both companies to allow her to handle the pirate problem. Then, she had done something no other species would have considered. She had broadcast the location of the most valuable mining facilities to every criminal organization in the sector. The resulting feeding frenzy as different pirate groups fought each other for the best targets had eliminated the threat entirely. By the time the battle royale ended, there were no surviving pirates left to threaten anyone. The mining companies got their peaceful resolution. The human mediator was quietly reassigned to civilian duties. Every time, Mordain said sadly, the same pattern. Humans achieve their objectives through methods that would be considered war crimes if used by any other species. Not because they're evil, but because they think differently about acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. The cadets absorbed this information in stunned silence. Their understanding of humanity had been completely inverted in the span of an hour. These weren't primitive beings who needed protection from galactic civilization. They were something far more dangerous masquerading as harmless mammals. So the ban, Crix began, is to protect us, Admiral Thexani confirmed. The Galactic Council realized that humans don't just win battles. They win them in ways that fundamentally challenge our concepts of honor, ethics, and proportional response. They're not too primitive for military service. They're too advanced, but in directions we're not comfortable following. The training chamber's atmosphere felt heavy with new understanding. These young cadets, representing the finest military minds of their generations, had just learned that everything they thought they knew about warfare was incomplete. Somewhere in the back of their minds, a new question was beginning to form. If humans were this effective in small-scale operations with primitive equipment, what would happen if they were ever allowed to develop proper military technology and training? It was a question the Galactic Council preferred not to answer. The revelation about human military capabilities sent shockwaves through the Academy's cadet population. In the days following Admiral Thexani's presentation, study groups formed spontaneously to discuss the implications. The Academy's vast library system logged thousands of requests for any available information about human history, psychology, and military doctrine. Zephyr found himself in one such group, gathered in the Academy's central hub during evening free time. The circular chamber accommodated beings with different gravitational and atmospheric needs, creating a unique environment where species that could never share the same planet could interact freely. I've been reading about their global conflicts, announced Vexera, a floating ethereal whose gaseous form shimmered with bioluminescent patterns. They've been fighting continuous wars for their entire recorded history. Not occasional conflicts over resources, but constant, overlapping battles involving multiple factions simultaneously. Sliss coiled tighter around her reading station. That supports the aggression theory. A species in perpetual conflict would naturally develop extreme military thinking. But that's what doesn't make sense, Crix interjected, her mandibles clicking rapidly, a sign of intense concentration among her people. I've analyzed their casualty reports from these conflicts. The numbers are moderate. For a species supposedly prone to berserker tactics, their historical wars show remarkable restraint. Zephyr leaned forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the group. What do you mean? Crix activated her personal display, showing population charts and battle statistics spanning human history. Look at this, the Battle of Gettysburg, one of their major historical engagements. 50,000 casualties over 3 days. For a species with a population of 30 million at the time, that's actually quite low. Compare that to the third Corvin expansion, Zephyr added grimly. My people lost twice that number in a single morning's charge. And we consider that a great victory. Vexera's patterns shifted to indicate puzzlement. So they're capable of restraint in their own conflicts, but become utterly ruthless when fighting for other species' objectives? Maybe it's about motivation, suggested Nimtar, a small Piscian whose childlike appearance belied her advanced tactical training. Humans seem to fight differently when they're protecting others versus pursuing their own goals. The group fell silent, processing this insight. It was a disturbing thought that humanity's most dangerous military characteristics only emerged when they were trying to help their allies. Across the academy, similar discussions were taking place. In the advanced xenopsychology seminars, senior cadets debated whether human psychology represented an evolutionary adaptation to perpetual warfare or something more fundamental about their species' development. Professor Yilthara, a Mindari whose telepathic abilities made her uniquely qualified to study other species' mental patterns, had become the center of intense academic interest. Her course on anomalous psychological profiles in military personnel was suddenly oversubscribed, with cadets desperate to understand how human minds worked. The human brain architecture is fascinating, she explained to a packed lecture hall. Her enlarged cranium pulsed with soft light as she projected her thoughts directly into the translation systems. They have what they call a limbic system, essentially an ancient reptilian brain core surrounded by more advanced cognitive structures. A Thrykin cadet raised one of her forearms. Professor, doesn't that suggest primitive emotional responses overriding logical thinking? That would explain their reckless behavior. Professor Yilthara's expression was thoughtful. Actually, it's more complex than that. The human limbic system doesn't just generate emotions. It processes threat assessment, social bonding, and survival priorities at speeds their conscious minds can't match. When humans make what we call emotional decisions, they're actually integrating massive amounts of subconscious data. She activated a holographic display showing brain skin patterns. This is a human commander's neural activity during the Frontier Station incident. Notice how their emotional centers are hyperactive, but rather than impeding logical thinking, they're enhancing it. The emotional response isn't separate from their tactical analysis. It's part of it. The implications were staggering. Human decision-making wasn't flawed by emotion. It was enhanced by emotional processing that other species lacked entirely. Meanwhile, in the Academy's Secure Communications Center, a different kind of revelation was taking place. Commander Vextai had been reviewing classified correspondence when an encrypted message arrived from the Galactic Council's Intelligence Division. The message was brief and disturbing. Human government has submitted formal appeal regarding Academy ban. Request includes classified military recordings demonstrating human capabilities. Council meeting scheduled to review appeal in 72 hours. Prepare Academy representatives for testimony. Commander Vextai's four hands trembled slightly as he read the implications. If humans were providing classified recordings of their own military operations, it meant they had capabilities beyond what even the Council knew. The ban had been based on incidents where humans worked alongside other species. What had they been doing when they worked alone? The commander activated his secure communication array and sent an urgent message to Admiral Thexani. Within minutes, the Academy's highest-ranking officers were gathering in the classified briefing chamber deep beneath the main campus. Admiral Thexani arrived looking older than her considerable years. Commander, I assume you've seen the Council communication? Yes, Admiral. Do we have any information about these recordings the humans are providing? Nothing definitive. But I've received some preliminary intelligence that suggests we may have underestimated the scope of human military development. The Admiral activated a holographic display showing star charts of human-controlled space. For the past 15 years, since the Frontier incident, humans have been systematically excluded from major military operations. We assumed this would limit their development. But they've continued developing independently, Commander Vextai realized. Exactly. And without our oversight or influence. Admiral Thexani highlighted several star systems on the edge of human space. These sectors have been experiencing unusual activity. Ships appearing and disappearing, energy signatures that don't match known human technology, and complete communication blackouts from areas that should be heavily trafficked. Instructor Mordain, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Admiral, are you suggesting humans have developed advanced military capabilities in secret? I'm suggesting that a species capable of the tactical innovations we witnessed might not have been content to remain at their current technological level. The Admiral's crystalline exoskeleton pulsed with worry patterns, especially if they felt excluded from galactic civilization. The implications were terrifying. Humanity had been banned from military service precisely because their methods were too effective and too ruthless. If they had spent 15 years developing those methods in isolation with advanced technology. Commander Vextai's communication array chimed with an incoming priority message. The identifier showed it was from the Galactic Council's emergency session. Admiral, he said, his voice tight with concern. The Council is requesting immediate transport to the capital system. They want Academy representatives present for the human appeal hearing. When? Tomorrow. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of security systems. The Academy's leadership was about to learn what humanity had been doing during their 15 years of military exile, and everyone present suspected it would not be pleasant news. Back in the student quarters, word of the emergency council session had somehow leaked through the Academy's information networks. Cadets gathered in common areas, speculating about what new revelations might emerge. Zephyr found himself unable to concentrate on his regular studies. The tactical simulations that had once challenged him now seemed simple compared to the human strategies he'd witnessed. How did you defend against an enemy that was willing to sacrifice anything, including themselves, to achieve their objectives? It changes everything, doesn't it? Sliss said, finding him in the observation lounge overlooking the Academy's artificial ocean. The vast body of water was designed to comfort species from aquatic worlds. But tonight it seemed more ominous than peaceful. What do you mean? All our training, all our theories about proper military conduct. If humans can achieve better results using methods we consider unacceptable, then maybe we're the ones who are wrong. Zephyr's tusks gleamed in the artificial starlight. That's a dangerous thought. Is it? Look at the casualty figures from those incidents. When humans were involved, fewer people died overall. Yes, they used extreme methods, but they saved more lives in the long run. Crix joined them, her chitinous armor reflecting the water's surface. I've been running combat simulations using human tactics. The results are disturbing. In every scenario where I applied human-style psychological warfare and acceptance of friendly casualties, the mission success rate increased dramatically. But at what cost? Zephyr demanded. Military service isn't just about winning battles. It's about maintaining our civilization's values while defending them. Unless, Sliss said quietly, the only way to preserve those values is to temporarily abandon them. The three cadets stood in silence, watching the artificial waves lap against the observation lounge's transparent walls. Each was grappling with the same fundamental question. What did it mean to be civilized when faced with an enemy that didn't share your constraints? Somewhere in the Academy's deepest vaults, automated systems were preparing classified files for transport to the Galactic Council chambers. Files that contained not just the incidents the cadets had seen, but dozens of other encounters where human personnel had demonstrated capabilities that defied explanation. The Salvage Rights War, where a single human negotiator had ended a three-way corporate conflict by convincing all parties to attack a common enemy that didn't exist. The Barrier Station siege, where human engineers had turned a defensive position into a trap that eliminated an entire invasion fleet. The Merchant Alliance crisis, where human mediators had solved a complex trade dispute by deliberately crashing the galactic economy for exactly 47 minutes. In each case, human methods had been effective beyond all reasonable expectations. And, in each case, the human personnel involved had been quietly transferred away from active duty, their methods classified, and their tactical innovations deemed too dangerous for general implementation. Now humanity was appealing their ban, and they claimed to have evidence of their suitability for military service. The question that terrified the Galactic Council was simple. What had humanity been doing during their 15 years of exile to develop this evidence? And what would it mean for galactic civilization if humans were allowed back into military service, armed with whatever they had learned in their isolation. The answers to those questions would reshape everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare, civilization, and the thin line between protection and destruction. Tomorrow's council session would determine not just humanity's future role in galactic society, but whether that society would survive the revelation of what humans had become when left to develop their military capabilities without oversight or restraint. The Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime were a marvel of architectural engineering, designed to accommodate representatives from every known sentient species. The massive dome could adjust its atmospheric composition, gravity fields, and even the flow of time itself to ensure all delegates could participate equally in galactic governance. Admiral Thexani stood in the Academy's designated observer section, her crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the chamber's shifting lights. Around her, representatives from 47 different species waited for the session to begin. The tension was palpable. Appeals to reverse military service bans were extremely rare, and everyone present suspected this case would be unprecedented. Commander Vextai activated his personal communication device, connecting to the Academy's remote viewing system. Back on the Academy station, thousands of cadets and instructors were watching the proceedings through secure feeds. The human appeal had become the most significant event in the Academy's 300-year history. The Council recognizes the human delegation, announced Prime Counselor Thexmar, an ancient being whose species had evolved beyond physical form eons ago. The Counselor's presence was felt rather than seen, a gravitational distortion that served as their representative in physical space. 3 humans entered the chamber's central speaking area. They moved with a measured precision that immediately caught Admiral Thexani's attention. These weren't the desperate, pleading representatives she had expected. They carried themselves like military officers, despite supposedly being civilian diplomats. The lead delegate was an elderly human female wearing simple dark clothing. Her gray hair was cut short, and her eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to command authority. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the chamber's translation systems. Honored counselors, my name is Admiral Sarah Chun, retired from Earth Defense Force. I appear before you today to challenge the ban on human participation in galactic military service. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Admiral Thexani's exoskeleton pulsed with surprise. Sarah Chun, the same human who had sacrificed her ship at the Battle of Kepler Station 15 years ago. But, according to all records, she had been killed in that incident. The ban was implemented, Chun continued, based on concerns about human psychological profiles and tactical methods. We understand these concerns. We also believe they were based on incomplete information about human capabilities and development. Prime Counselor Thexmar's gravitational field shifted slightly. Admiral Chun, our records indicate you were killed in action 15 years ago during the Frontier incident. Chin's expression didn't change. The explosion of my ship's reactor was carefully calculated to appear fatal while allowing survival in an escape pod. My apparent death was strategically useful for subsequent operations that required a deceased officer. The chamber fell silent. The casual admission that she had faked her own death for operational purposes sent chills through every delegate present. This wasn't the behavior of a primitive species seeking acceptance. It was the calculated move of a master strategist. During our 15 years of military isolation, Chun continued, humanity has not been idle. We have used this time to develop our capabilities, refine our methods, and prepare for eventual reintegration with galactic society. We believe the time has come to demonstrate that human military service would benefit, not threaten, galactic security. She gestured to her companions, who activated a portable holographic projector. The display that materialized made Admiral Thexani's breath catch in her crystalline throat. It showed a star chart of a region beyond the edge of known galactic space. But this was an empty void. It was filled with activity. Ships, stations, and energy signatures that defied easy categorization. The Scourge, Chin said simply. Every delegate in the chamber recognized the name. The Scourge were a nomadic species of technological parasites that consumed entire civilizations, stripping worlds bare of resources and leaving nothing but dead rock in their wake. For 3,000 years, They had been moving steadily toward the galactic core, destroying everything in their path. The Galactic Council's best estimates suggested the Scourge would reach inhabited space in another 500 years. Military strategists had long debated how to handle this existential threat, but no consensus had emerged. The Scourge's technology was beyond current galactic capabilities, and their numbers seemed endless. 18 months ago, Chun continued, the Scourge reached the outer edge of human space. Our monitoring stations detected their approach and prepared defensive measures according to established protocols. The holographic display zoomed in on a specific system. Admiral Thexani watched in growing amazement as the tactical picture became clear. 3 Scourge harvester fleets, each the size of a small moon, were approaching a human colony world. Standard galactic doctrine would call for immediate evacuation, Chen noted. The destruction of the colony would be regrettable, but inevitable. Humanity chose a different approach. What followed challenged everything the Council thought they knew about warfare. Instead of fleeing, the human defenders had done something unprecedented. They had allowed the Scourge to begin their harvesting process. The massive alien ships descended to the planet's surface, deploying their consuming technologies to strip away the world's resources. For 3 days, they fed undisturbed while human ships remained at the system's edge, apparently powerless to intervene. Then, the trap was sprung. The human colonists hadn't evacuated, they had gone underground, into shelters that weren't designed for protection but for concealment. And those shelters contained something the Scourge couldn't detect: massive stockpiles of antimatter explosives. When the charges detonated simultaneously across the planet's surface, they created a chain reaction that turned the entire world into a massive bomb. The Scourge harvesters, caught in the middle of their feeding process, were vaporized instantly. The shock waves spread outward, crippling support vessels and destroying the entire fleet. 17 million humans died in that detonation, Chen said quietly. They volunteered for the operation knowing there was no possibility of survival. Their sacrifice eliminated 3 Scourge fleets that would have otherwise threatened dozens of inhabited systems. The chamber was dead silent. The delegates struggled to process what they had witnessed. The deliberate sacrifice of an entire world, including its population, to achieve a military objective was beyond their comprehension. But Chen wasn't finished. That was our first encounter. Over the past 18 months, humanity has engaged the Scourge in 47 separate battles. We have developed new tactics, new technologies, and new methods of warfare specifically designed to combat this threat. The holographic display shifted, showing battle after battle. In each engagement, humans employed strategies that would have been considered impossible or insane by galactic standards. Suicide attacks on scales that defied belief, psychological warfare campaigns designed to cause terror rather than achieve surrender, and technological applications that pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or ethical. And, in every case, they won. The Scourge advance has been stopped, Chen announced. 17 of their harvester fleets have been destroyed. Their remaining forces have withdrawn beyond the galactic rim, and our intelligence suggests they are seeking easier targets in other galaxies. Admiral Thexani felt her exoskeleton go cold. Humanity hadn't just survived contact with the galaxy's greatest threat, they had defeated it. And they had done so using methods that no other species would have even considered. We understand, Chun continued, that our methods are disturbing to galactic sensibilities. We sacrifice what others would preserve. We accept casualties that others would find unacceptable. We employ tactics that others would consider war crimes. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled delegates. But we win. And, in the case of an existential threat like the Scourge, winning is the only moral choice. Prime Counselor Thexmar's gravitational field fluctuated with what might have been distress. Admiral Chan, are you suggesting that humanity's inclusion in galactic military forces would involve the adoption of such extreme methods? I'm suggesting, Chen replied, that there are enemies coming that will require extreme methods to defeat. The Scourge were just the beginning. Our deep space monitoring systems have detected at least 3 other hostile forces moving toward galactic space. Forces that make the Scourge look primitive by comparison. A new holographic display appeared, showing long-range sensor data from beyond the galactic edge. Energy signatures that dwarfed entire star systems, fleet formations that stretched across light years, and technological capabilities that seemed to bend the laws of physics. The galaxy faces a choice, Chen said. You can continue to conduct warfare according to civilized rules, using methods that preserve your cultural values while your enemies destroy everything you've built. Or you can accept that survival sometimes requires abandoning civilization temporarily in order to preserve it permanently. The chamber erupted in debate as delegates began arguing among themselves. Some species demanded immediate rejection of the human appeal, horrified by the methods that had been demonstrated. Others pointed out that humanity had achieved what the entire galactic navy had considered impossible, the defeat of the Scourge. Through it all, Admiral Chun stood calmly in the center of the chaos, waiting for the debate to run its course. She had presented her evidence. Now it was up to the galaxy to decide what it was willing to become in order to survive. Admiral Thexani found herself faced with a terrible realization. The Academy had banned humans because their methods were too effective and too ruthless. But those same methods had just saved galactic civilization from threats it didn't even know existed. The question was no longer whether humans should be allowed back into military service. The question was whether the galaxy could afford to keep them out when worse enemies than the Scourge were already on their way. Back at the Academy, cadets watched the proceedings in stunned silence. Everything they thought they knew about warfare, about civilization, about the nature of acceptable military conduct, had been shattered in the span of a single presentation. Zephyr stared at the holographic displays showing human victories against impossible odds, achieved through methods that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "What have we become?" he whispered. But Sliss, coiled tight with tension, asked the more important question: what do we need to become to survive what's coming? The answer to that question would determine not just humanity's role in galactic society, but the very nature of what that society would need to become in the face of threats that made the Scourge look like a minor inconvenience. The debate in the council chambers continued, but Admiral Chen knew the real decision had already been made. The galaxy had seen what humanity was capable of, and it would have to decide whether it was willing to become something similar. Because the enemies approaching would accept nothing less than total victory or total extinction. And humanity had just demonstrated that they knew exactly how to achieve both. The council debate raged for 6 hours before Prime Counselor Thexmar finally called for order. The chamber's atmospheric processors had worked overtime to accommodate the heated exchanges between species with radically different environmental needs and equally different perspectives on warfare ethics. Admiral Thexani had watched it all from the observer section, her crystalline exoskeleton pulsing with patterns of deep contemplation. The arguments had been as brutal as they were predictable. The Corvin delegate had demanded immediate acceptance of human military service, pointing out that his species respected strength above all else. The Mindari representative had argued for continued exclusion, claiming that human methods would corrupt the telepathic unity that kept their civilization stable. But it was the small species, the ones who had always depended on galactic protection rather than providing it, who surprised everyone. Delegate after delegate from minor worlds stood to argue that humanity's methods, however disturbing, had achieved something the great powers had considered impossible. Admiral Chun had remained silent throughout the debate, occasionally consulting with her 2 companions but never attempting to influence the discussion. Her patience was itself unsettling. She waited like a predator that knew its prey would eventually come within reach. Prime Counselor Thexmar's gravitational field shifted as they prepared to announce the preliminary decision. The Council has reviewed the evidence presented by the human delegation. While we acknowledge the effectiveness of human military methods against the Scourge threat, we cannot ignore the fundamental incompatibility between human warfare doctrine and galactic civilization principles. A wave of disappointment rippled through some observers, while others seemed relieved. Admiral Thexani felt her own emotions conflicted. Part of her was grateful that humanity's disturbing methods would remain isolated, while another part recognized the terrible vulnerability this decision represented. However, the counselor continued, we cannot ignore the intelligence regarding approaching threats. The Council hereby establishes a new classification, Auxiliary emergency forces. Humans will be permitted to maintain independent military units under their own command structure, operating in coordination with but not integration into standard galactic forces. Chin's expression didn't change, but Admiral Thexani detected a slight tension in her posture that suggested satisfaction. This wasn't quite what humanity had requested, but it was perhaps what they had actually expected. There are conditions, Thexmar added. Human forces will operate under strict oversight. Their methods may not be employed against galactic citizens under any circumstances, and any human personnel serving in these auxiliary units will undergo mandatory psychological evaluation every 6 months. Understood, Chen replied. However, we require reciprocal conditions. When galactic forces request human assistance with existential threats, our tactical recommendations must be given serious consideration rather than dismissed due to cultural squeamishness. The bluntness of her statement sent another wave of unease through the chamber. Even in accepting limitations on their military role, humans were demanding the right to influence how other species conducted warfare. Furthermore, Chun continued, we request permission to establish joint training facilities with volunteer forces from other species, not to teach our methods to the unwilling, but to prepare the willing for the realities of existential warfare. This was the moment Admiral Thexani had been dreading. The implication was clear. Humanity intended to share their tactical innovations with any species brave enough to learn them. The contamination of galactic military doctrine wouldn't be prevented by the Council's decision, merely controlled. Prime Counselor Thexmar consulted with the other Council members through methods that transcended physical communication. When they spoke again, their gravitational field had taken on a resigned quality. The Council accepts these conditions. However, participation in joint human training programs must be entirely voluntary and subject to individual species approval. No government may compel their citizens to undergo human military instruction. Agreed, Chen said immediately. We prefer volunteers anyway. Conscripts lack the psychological flexibility required for our methods. With that simple exchange, the future of galactic military doctrine was fundamentally altered. Humanity would remain partially excluded from standard forces, but their influence would spread through voluntary adoption of their tactics and training. The formal session concluded with administrative details and scheduling of follow-up meetings. But the real implications of the decision would play out over the months and years to come. Back at the academy, the mood was somber as cadets processed what they had witnessed. The holographic displays in common areas replayed portions of Chen's presentation, but many cadets found themselves unable to watch the more extreme demonstrations of human tactical thinking. Zephyr sat in the observation lounge where he had first grappled with the implications of human military methods. This time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of cadets from different species had gathered, all struggling with the same fundamental questions about the nature of civilized warfare. They're going to build that training facility, Sliss said, her serpentine form coiled tight with tension. And some of us are going to volunteer. Crix's mandibles clicked nervously. The question is whether we should. Everything they've shown us contradicts our basic training about proportional response and acceptable casualties. But it works, Nimtar pointed out. The small Pishian had been quiet throughout most discussions, but now her voice carried unexpected steel. My homeworld is in the outer territories. If something like the Scourge appears in our region, standard galactic doctrine would mean abandoning 3 billion civilians to save the fleet. Human doctrine would mean sacrificing 3 billion civilians to save the galaxy, Zephyr countered. Would it? Nimtar challenged. Look at their actual results. Human methods produced lower total casualties than standard evacuation protocols would have achieved. Yes, they accepted horrific local losses, but they prevented even worse systematic destruction. The debate that followed was a microcosm of the larger struggle taking place throughout galactic society. Young military minds, trained in traditional concepts of honor and proportional response, found themselves confronting evidence that their methods might be inadequate for existential threats. Some, like Vex Sarah, argued passionately that civilization meant nothing if it abandoned civilized methods. Others, like Nimtar, pointed out that civilization meant nothing if it didn't survive to practice civilized methods. Meanwhile, in the Academy's administrative levels, Admiral Thexani was having her own crisis of conscience. A message had arrived from the Galactic Defense Coordination Center requesting Academy input on implementation of the Council's decision. The message was routine, professional, and terrifying. It asked for recommendations on which Academy graduates might be suitable candidates for the new joint training programs with human forces. The implication was clear. The Academy was being asked to identify its most promising students for instruction in human warfare methods. Admiral Thexani found herself staring at the cadet roster, trying to imagine which of these young beings possessed the psychological flexibility to learn human tactics without being consumed by them. It was an impossible choice. The most mentally adaptable cadets were also the ones most likely to be fundamentally changed by exposure to human military thinking. But, as she reviewed intelligence reports about the approaching threats Chun had mentioned, she realized the choice might not be hers to make. If galactic civilization was going to survive the coming conflicts, it would need defenders capable of thinking like humans when necessary. The question was whether those defenders would still be recognizable as the species they started as. 3 weeks later, the first applications for the joint training program began arriving at the Academy. To everyone's surprise, they came from the most unlikely candidates. Crix submitted her application with a formal statement that her species' hive mind thinking might benefit from exposure to individual human decision-making processes. Nimtar applied because she wanted to better protect small worlds that couldn't defend themselves through conventional means. Most shocking of all was Zephyr's application. The massive Corvin, whose species valued honor above all else, wrote simply, "If human methods can achieve victory with fewer total casualties, then honor demands I learn these methods, regardless of personal cost." Not all applications were approved. The screening process was rigorous, designed to identify candidates who could learn human tactics without losing their moral foundations. But those who were accepted found themselves facing a training regimen unlike anything in galactic military history. The human instructors were former Earth Defense Force officers who had fought the Scourge. They taught not just tactics and strategy, but the psychological frameworks necessary to make decisions that prioritized long-term survival over short-term preservation of life. Admiral Chun herself occasionally visited the training facility, observing the progress of alien students learning to think like humans. She took particular interest in the psychological adaptation scores, tracking how exposure to human methods affected different species' mental patterns. The results were both promising and disturbing. Students who successfully integrated human tactical thinking showed dramatic improvements in combat effectiveness and strategic planning. But they also showed measurable changes in their fundamental value systems, becoming more willing to accept casualties and more focused on mission success than individual preservation. Some species found these changes unacceptable and withdrew their volunteers. Others, recognizing the approaching threats, requested expanded training programs. As the months passed, a new generation of galactic military officers emerged. They retained the cultural values of their species, but possessed the tactical flexibility to employ human methods when necessary. They became known as the Bridge Generation, beings who could operate between traditional galactic warfare and human extremism. When the next existential threat arrived, the Convergence, a machine intelligence that consumed entire star systems to fuel its expansion, the galaxy was ready. The initial response followed traditional protocols, attempting negotiation and proportional force. When those methods failed, and the Convergence destroyed 2 inhabited systems in 3 days, the Council activated the auxiliary protocols. Human forces, supported by Bridge Generation officers from a dozen species, implemented tactics that shocked even their allies. They turned the Convergence's own adaptive intelligence against it by feeding it false data that caused catastrophic calculation errors. They sacrificed entire fleets in carefully orchestrated suicide attacks that appeared random, but actually followed mathematical patterns designed to exploit machine logic flaws. They abandoned traditional concepts of acceptable losses in favor of systematic destruction of the Convergence's resource base. The war lasted for months. The Convergence was utterly destroyed, its machine consciousness shattered beyond possibility of reconstruction. The victory came at a terrible cost. 12 billion sentient beings died in the conflict, including entire volunteer fleets that chose extinction rather than surrender. But galactic civilization survived. And, in surviving, it began to understand what Admiral Chen had tried to tell them in that council chamber. Civilization wasn't about maintaining peaceful methods. It was about ensuring that there would be someone left to remember what peaceful methods were for. The galaxy had learned to think like humans when necessary. The question now was whether it could remember how to think like itself when the necessity passed. That question would define the future of galactic civilization as it faced the greatest truth humanity had taught them. Sometimes, the only way to preserve what you value is to become temporarily willing to destroy everything, including yourself, to protect it. The alien cadets who had once laughed at the human band no longer laughed at anything. They had learned what their human instructors had always known, that the universe contained threats that could only be defeated by beings willing to become temporarily monstrous in service of something greater than themselves. They had become the bridge between civilization and survival. And, in that role, they would face the ultimate test of whether sentient beings could maintain their humanity while learning to fight like humans. The answer to that question would determine not just their survival, but their souls.